right, good afternoon, everybody. I want to start first by seconding and adding to the words of thanks and congratulations to Dr. Ibtisam and to EPC and her, what she calls her family. I was fortunate enough to be here on the first ADSD, and now I'm here on the 10th. It's a remarkable achievement, and as somebody had said in one earlier panel, once you go past the threshold of 10, you've made it. You can survive. So congratulations, Mabruk, and thank you so much for inviting us. Today's panel, the global geo-economic competition, resources, players, high-tech, and trends. We have a terrific panel. Fortunately or unfortunately, two of our colleagues will be participating by Zoom. One of them is in California, which is about, by my estimate, about 4:30 in the morning her time, so I thank her for her courage and her commitment to this. Let me start out by making some introductory comments about the subject matter. We're all aware, or very keenly aware, of the fact that global geo-economics has been undergoing a very profound process of change, and the rate of change is actually accelerating as we speak. Within this change, new players are emerging, and consistent with the theme of this conference, Old Politics, New Age, old players are reasserting themselves, perhaps in ways that may be different than in the past. So I'm going to make three comments regarding the issue of geopolitics, geoeconomics, and the link between the two. The first is the competition, which is the theme of this, this panel. Within the global participants is a competition over two key determinants. One is competition over natural resources, and the other is competition over technology and access to both. The third point I'll make is that the competition that is emerging, both for natural resources and for technology, has become tougher and more difficult, and because it has become more concentrated. It's more concentrated both in terms of the availability of those resources and the access to them. In the case of natural resources, whether it's natural gas, oil, energy, food, or some of the newer resources that are being used, rare earth minerals and others, they're all either available in very limited number of countries around the world, or the processing and access to them is also limited to a small number of countries that create them. Same thing is true in terms of technology. We all know that the West, United States, Europe, Japan, and increasingly countries like China and India have become the major holders of innovation and new technologies that are emerging. And although its use is being spread out, but the origins of these and the changes that those technologies are impacting the world are limited to a small number of countries in this. So with this kind of background, we have a very, very talented panel with a diverse set of skills. And I'm going to use the opportunity to start by asking my panelists a series of questions related to that. And the first question I want to ask Dr. Ahmedou, is tell us a little bit about how you see this emergence of in geoeconomics and it's linked to geopolitics. As a former foreign minister of a country that has been involved and deeply immersed in these issues, and as a member of strategic studies organization, how do you see the competition between the two, and where is it leading us to?
Thank you. So do I need, it is okay now? Yeah. Thank you very much. First of all, I'm very happy to be here and to congratulate the leader, Peterson, for organizing, not only for her leadership, but for organizing this meeting successful, in my opinion, in many things: composition, participation at all levels. Second, I like the title, Geo-Economics. And when I was younger, we remember we have been always told of Clausewitz, the German specialist. He used to say the war is the pursuit of economy. The war is pursuit of politics by other means. I think Geo-Economics is the pursuit of not war, I mean, a pursuit of war by other means. We don't have World War I, World War II, though there is war now in Ukraine and in Gaza, but economy is becoming the leadership. And how I see the situation, I see it as leadership. Economy being very important, we mostly think of the way larger countries support and successfully meet their goals. I'm thinking of US, of China, but we should also think of the smaller countries being successful in a number of limited areas. For instance, we are here in the Emirates, and for the last 10 years, I heard of the Dubai port, autonomous port, successful being in Africa, in many Asia. So the economy, in my opinion, Geo-Economics, I see it as the new competition, because war is very, not only boring, but it's not interesting, increasingly, except for politicians. So my point is, Geo-Economics is the pursuit of diplomacy, politics by other war, by other means, investment, especially in economy, infrastructure, and so on. And I see 2 or 3 smaller countries imposing themselves between China, for instance, and the United States, being successful.
Thank you so much. One of the key changes that are taking place in the global economy is the increased connectivity between countries and within regions. And that increased connectivity has given rise to an economic concept which has to do with the value chains. And these value chains have become global and have become centers of transfer for trade, for investment, for manufacturing, and what have you. To the extent that these value chains became an integral part of the economy, they have become tested over the last several years with natural disasters in Asia and other places that disrupted the flow of goods and services, and more recently in the case of COVID, that tested the global value chain to a very large extent and created national security issues as well as economic issues. Dr. Etel Solingen, distinguished professor, and the Thomas and Elizabeth Tierney Chair, Peace, Conflict, and Studies at the University of California, has done very great work in that area. And I want to ask her a question, which is, what impact those value chains do you see on the current transformation of the global economy, and how will it impact competition between both the global powers as well as the smaller regional subset of those powers. Etel?
First, let me thank Dr. Al-Ketbi for her kind invitation, and congratulations on the 10th anniversary. I am joining you from California, and it is 4:30 a.m. I haven't gone to sleep at all, but I'll do my best. So my analysis of geopolitical risks to GVCs, global value chains, builds on a book I did with Cambridge University Press, and a chapter for the GVC Development Report published by the WTO, the Asian Development Bank, and other international institutions. And both address a long-standing interest in the contributions of economic interdependence to international security. And those were themes mentioned in introductory remarks by Dr. Al-Ketbi and His Excellency Dr. Gargash. Over a decade ago, I began working on the hypothesis that GVCs might engender novel mechanisms that raise the cost of foregoing interdependence, and thus foster stronger incentives to sustain peaceful relations. And that those effects, I thought, would be especially relevant to complex GVCs, complex value chains with a high proportion of intangibles, R&D, technology, etc. After all, 4 decades of striking GVC expansion in East Asia under outward-oriented political economy strategies coincided with restraint in handling long-standing disputes. Whether GVCs had that effect or not, geopolitical stability, predictability, and cooperation clearly enabled GVC expansion since the 1980s. It would be hard to imagine that expansion throughout East Asia against the scenario of violent wars that were typical of East Asia in earlier times. But sadly, the last decade presents a very tough test to that proposition, and I think it's incumbent upon us to understand why and how we got there. I'll have more to say about the sources of tensions later or during Q&As, but for now, I'd like to make 5 brief points. First, this is a season of extensive debate over the sources of China's economic decline, rising unemployment, creeping deflation, etc. China's gauge for FDI just went negative for the first time since 1998. But there is much public disinformation on the sources of this malaise. The Biden administration does not seek to undermine China's economy. It fully understands that the health of China's economy is a public good, and that the welfare of both countries is intertwined and indivisible. Either both do well or both suffer. And Secretary Janet Yellen just today reiterated for the nth time that this is not about decoupling, and she was now today facing Chinese Vice Premier He Fang. Second, most leading economists agree that China's economic decline is internal to China, and experts may differ on whether the source of this predicament in China is prioritization of state-owned enterprises at the expense of private markets, or ever tighter political control, huge debt, lack of transparency, market access, IP, intellectual property violations, subsidies, the breed, China 2025, zero COVID, you name it. But there is significant quantitative evidence that Russia's assault, and I'll be happy to cite that later on, significant quantitative evidence that Russia's assault on Ukraine accelerated GVC diversification away from China dramatically, especially by EU firms. Number 3, Even non-economists, including most leading China experts, I would argue, believe that an economically diminished China is not in the US interest. Scholars in and out of the administration are deeply familiar with the potential of economic, social, and political downturns to fuel aggressive foreign policies. So China's economic collapse is in nobody's interest. Number 4, what is at the heart of Biden's geopolitical and geo-economic agenda? It's domestic politics, just as in China. Bidenomics is geared to strengthening the middle class and ensuring a fair distribution of gains from trade. Now, one may quarrel about whether or not industrial policy is the way to get there. Some think not. But that's an entirely different debate, an intense one, rooted both in lessons from economic theory and in empirical data. Because countries that spent themselves to oblivion in subsidies and protection fail to reap expected benefits, typically, accumulate huge debt, and risk transitions out of middle-income traps. The final point I'm going to make on this is that there is considerable consensus, despite everything I said, there is considerable consensus on maintaining a technological edge and regulating exports to preclude others from using them in offensive military capabilities or wars of conquest, as in Ukraine. There is also frustration with an open global economy lacking reciprocity, transparency, market access, etc. So yes, much of the industrialized world is diversifying GVCs and de-risking them, thinking that it may protect them from coercive practices. There is unusual convergence across OECD members on this goal. The debate, though, is over the optimal size of the proverbial yard and the effectiveness of its firewalls, to use Sullivan's vocabulary. But OECD countries are making very important progress in developing necessary authorities to tighten up controls of illegal transfers, illegal imports, illegal disinformation. But once again, the objective is neither decoupling nor a Cold War.
Thank you so much. De-risking, diversification of supply chains, the new 2022 US President Biden's CHIPS bill, the $1 trillion bill, seem to all be mindful of China. And it's no longer a competition, it's perceived as being more than that. So you spent quite a bit of time in China. And I'd like to see if you could give us your sense of how is it perceived by the Chinese side, and to what extent are these diversification of supply chains and other restrictions that particularly the United States and to some extent Europe is imposing on trade with China in certain areas of technology, especially high-end technology.
Okay. Well, let me make one clarification. I'm an American. I live in Beijing, and I've been there since 2005. I appreciate my colleagues' remarks, but we must be reading different data. The fact is, Jörg Gutke, who's been president of three times president of the European Chamber, who just stepped down, I get his monthly reports from there, and it's quite clear that the EU has been reinvesting in China. Now, let's really talk about the elephant in the room here, which is the fact that everything we're talking about today in regard to China has to do with the fact of China's success. If you think for one instance, we would be talking about China if it was a failure, obviously. So what is it that drives the United States crazy about China? Well, simply it has a different system. As my previous speaker said, China says, calm down, okay? Well, the fact is that the US isn't happy about the fact that it took between Europe and the US During the WTO years, when China was rising, 2/3 of all the profits went where? US and Europe. The fact that they were not shared, that you have income disparities, that the US runs its economy like a Ponzi scheme. And I mean that. Think about it. What is the definition of a Ponzi scheme? You borrow money to pay interest or principal back to people you borrowed money from. The US is now expanding this year. It'll add a couple $1 trillion to its $31 trillion in debt. There's no plan to pay it back. Yet people continue to buy. Why? Because the dollar is a trade currency. So when you start talking about this idea that global trade and digitalization and all these things, what are we really talking about? This is the next phase. I would suggest to you that in the next 10 to 15 years, there will be a very clear division between the haves and haves not, and that will be based on who owns the digital IP. Those who own it will be served by those who don't. The US answer, much like during the pandemic, is to say, well, we have our companies. Yes, they use public dollars for their research, but now they can claim it and they can make money on it. China's answer was to start shipping factories overseas. They did this for 20 countries, including UAE, which received a tremendous number of these vaccines. Right? Very different approaches. Right now, China is saying, look, we need to have joint development of technology, especially in the digital area. In UAE is a center now for renminbi trading, clearinghouse. It is not trying to keep it all in one place. It's going to have a series of clearinghouses. And we all know that people are responding to this because they're concerned about the US dollar. The fact is, Janet Yellen is talking to Mr. He about the fact that she needs somebody to start buying these bonds that she's going to put into the market. Next year, what is it, 250 billion or something like that is going to come onto the market, and it's not clear how it's going to be received. So when you're thinking about all these issues about digitalization and competition, keep in mind that this is the Tonya Harding defense. Tonya Harding was somebody who wanted to compete in the Olympics, but she was afraid her best friend, another fellow American, would beat her. So she had her boyfriend go out and try to break her legs. Well, what do we have here? The US is saying, well, we don't want China to rise. And this idea that somehow it's all benevolent is nonsense. You don't surround a country with 400 bases and look for more because you want to be benevolent. And this idea that China will close down the waterways in which it is dependent on both resources coming in, because China does not like the US, it doesn't have lots of resources. It's near 100 out of 200 nations in resources per person. The idea that it would shut that source off, 80% of its imported oil, coming from where? Middle East. And also shut off the exports, where it adds values to these raw materials and then sends them out. When has it happened? When has China threatened to shut down the seas? China's real concern is that it's the US who will, with their encircled bases, be in a position to, in essence, try to effect an embargo. That's why you had the Belt and Road Initiative. I will leave it there to my future colleagues. I don't want to talk too long.
Thank you very much. So what you're saying, sorry?
Could I go to the issue of data and what data we're looking at? Because I have some actually from the American Chamber of Commerce, some figures I'd like to provide. I can also wait for another term. Okay, we'll go back and revisit this issue. So what you're arguing is that there is a gap between what the US says.
Well, she mentioned the European Chamber.
No, I understand.
So now we're going to American. Good.
Right.
I know both I know both of the heads of the chambers.
Okay, can we go back to this issue?
Yes.
I want to turn to Dr. Mazarei in Washington. Good morning. So there's been a lot of discussion about China's slowing economy, about issues of trade between U.S. and China in technology and in other areas. So you're looking at the global international economic issues. I wanted to see if you have your own vision or estimate of how this global economy, as it now exists, and its forces that are impacting it, will shape up over the next several years, and who, to some extent, players who do not currently play a very major role will be entering into this arena, and how will they shape that direction of change in the global economy?
Thank you. And none of my comments have been written by ChatGPT. Look, as probably you've heard all day, there are considerable shocks to the world economy and very distinct trends that are going to make all our lives more difficult, or at least interesting. Demographic, technological, climate, pandemics, and geopolitics. There are chances of more frequent and simultaneous crises. We know much less about some of the issues than we think we do. And we also have much less room than we think we do in terms of fiscal space and our debt positions globally. On demographics, key thing for me is there is aging in Europe, China, and Japan. This means greater reliance on areas such as Africa. Now, we're at the same time observing greater barriers to migration. So we're faced with a conundrum of either the populations moving or capital moving. On technology, we have new technologies, obviously. They could raise productivity and growth, but there could also be considerable impact on income distribution globally. And it is very hard to predict with confidence how things are going to go. AI and other digital technologies could improve governance, but at the same time could lead to greater stifling of individual rights and privacy, with considerable political and social consequences. We also know less about supply chains than we think we do. For example, in critical minerals, some of my friends and I did a study for the Peterson Institute where we showed it isn't just where the mines are or where the processing firms are. If you need to look at the shareholding patterns and to see who, through shareholding power, controls those companies. For example, we found out in lithium, Chinese companies have much more power than we usually assume. On geopolitics, we are seeing, in some ways, China, the West, versus the rest. The rest will not necessarily form a unified group like the non-aligned movement of the past. They will be much more transactional. A key issue will be India, and much will depend on how India conducts itself, whether it wants to be an economy or a cause. And there are risks about how it may behave. For example, I would not be shocked if they exit the BRICS organization. There's also greater need, obviously, as we see and others have discussed, need to diversify investments and financial flows, especially to avoid sanctions and concentration in payment systems. And unfortunately, we'll probably see an increase in defense spending, especially after the events in the Middle East. These will lead to lower growth, higher interest rates, and more debt problems. Now, the difficult part for me is that we are going to probably see very important social and political changes. Fear of populism may lead to more protectionism. Energy transition will be difficult because it will involve, at least in the countries in the Middle East and North Africa, removal of subsidies. There will be chances of greater backward-looking social movements and non-state actors. At the same time, management of these crises will become different, and we will need different models of corporate management, multi-country instead of country-focused crisis management, especially by the multilateral institutions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. I want to follow up on this point you made about the energy transition and the availability of resources and the role of countries in accessing those resources. You mentioned lithium as being an example. Lithium is produced for the most part in 3 or 4 Latin American countries. Cobalt is another important component of new industrial products. It's produced in only 1 country in Africa. Yet the processing of those specialized minerals is done and dominated by Chinese companies. Even in the new batteries that are supposed to be based on sodium chloride, salt, that basically deliver the same quantities of energy in a less efficient way than lithium does. But salt is available everywhere, freely almost, and yet Chinese companies control almost 80 to 90% of the transformation of that salt into batteries in there. So it's not just simply the availability, but it's the technology that goes behind it. But you did mention about the energy transition, and I wanted to ask, we've been talking about climate change and energy transition for now at least 2 decades, and we're in COP28 here in the UAE. Last year, COP28 was in Egypt, and there's a lot of interest in the region in energy transition. And yet, we have not been making very good progress in energy transition. Fossil fuels are still dominant in the energy production. And there's been a new theory that maybe we should focus on the demand, not the supply, which has been the standard approach to it. So I wanted to get a view as to why it's been so slow to have that energy transition, and to what extent there are things that we should be doing that we're not doing that will accelerate that and move towards new sources of energy. Dr. Adnan?
Thank you. Look, first of all, there is a recognition problem that this is an urgent problem. Many people play lip service to it. Some others are doing more. For example, in the Middle East and North Africa, the GCC countries, some of them, like UAE and Saudi Arabia, are taking some steps, but these are allowed by huge balance sheets that they have and huge resources, financial resources. Many others don't have the resources. Another issue is the absence, for many other countries, this absence of financing is significant. There is going to be large amounts of money needed. In some countries, there is going to be reliance on public sector money and even money from the multilateral development banks. But these funds are not going to be enough. There would need to be involvement of the domestic private sectors of these countries and also international ones. But financing is not the only constraint. Of course, there is technology, there is availability of critical minerals, as you mentioned, infrastructure, removal of subsidies, need for new skills in management of firms, but perhaps more important than all of these, governance and regulatory reforms in many of the countries that would allow these private investments. There would need to be some changes in social contracts of some of the countries to allow better and quicker removal of fuel subsidies. For example, they're the highest in the world in the Middle East and North African countries. There are efforts, especially in Europe, to put in place carbon pricing. The US does not focus on carbon pricing as much. My own view is that we probably need to rely more on technology than on pricing. But these are also going to be sources of conflicts between the US and Europe and other countries.
Thank you so much, Dr. Solingen. You made the point about the diversification of global value chains. One of the biggest challenges in global value chains has been the logistics of moving things around, especially if you have different components produced at different places and shifted around. To the extent that we're diversifying, it means we're diversifying away from China. And countries like Vietnam and India and others are supposed to be taking up the slack. Yet China controls almost 70–80% of the shipping capacity, the big ports that can handle large volume of goods and services, which probably at the end result in shifting more production to Europe and to the United States. What is the likelihood that this could happen within a reasonably short period of time? And what are the economic implications of doing that in terms of increasing cost to consumers and other related items?
Yeah, we have to get to that, but I want to clarify the data that was cited. I want to just give a little background. Russia's invasion heightened the risk that it compounded previous shocks and triggered the highest level of business uncertainty since 2005. There's an index that measures uncertainty, business uncertainty. According to the 2022 UNCTAD data, of the 1.2 trillion FDI in 2022, 180 billion shifted from countries that supported Russian UN votes to those who condemned the invasion. Why? What might be the causal mechanism here? Well, firms simply have big-time recalculated risk, especially hedging against so-called gray rhinos or known plausible risks. They linked support for Russia's invasion by some countries to heightened risk that military aggression could be replicated elsewhere. And this firm-level adjusted risk assessment led to increased discussions of offshoring, reshoring, or nearshoring in corporate boardrooms, higher than at any time before. So by April 2022, this is a year ago, I have even more recent data. A European Chamber of Business Confidence survey already showed 33% of respondents expressing that the Ukraine war made China even less attractive beyond concerns with zero COVID, market access, intellectual property, etc. And the Chamber's president, Jörg Butke, pronounced Europe-China relations, even back then, drifting, and I quote, drifting further and further apart. In a position paper available to any of you to read, that he described as the darkest ever, declaring that Chinese firms actually were more interested in Europe than vice versa. There are more recent comments by Woodgate that I could come back later. But now let me move to the American Chamber of Commerce, this one in Shanghai. The 2023 survey finds that only 17% of its members listed China as the #1 investment destination globally, down from 27% in 2021. These are again, surveys that you can reach via the internet, that they're open to anybody. And in this and other surveys, firms blame China's business climate, US-China tensions, and slow growth in China. And they identify the top 3 barriers to innovation to be technology decoupling, restricting cybersecurity policy, and insufficient IP protection. 70% of those firms labeled data localization and other cybersecurity requirements as a big hindrance to business, further increasing uncertainty and cost, along with burdens on due diligence firms, rigid capital control, and strict new laws for data and anti-espionage, all of which makes activities subject to arbitrary punishment. Today's Financial Times reports that China's amended anti-espionage and data laws threaten to spur decoupling with Europe, just today. And many cite, again, this lack of transparency and favoritism of local firms. Now, to your point about where all this is going, where the action is going, about 40% are redirecting or planning to redirect investment originally planned for China, with Southeast Asia as the most favored destination, followed by the US, Mexico, and Europe. Now, the pessimistic views about the status quo, meaning the incentive to move out, rose from 73% in late 2022, early 2023, to 87% more recently. And perhaps most telling is the huge reluctance of foreign employees to return to China, especially in services, 87%, but also in tech, nearly 70%. And perhaps even more telling is this IMF 2023 text mining analysis of earning calls report from a large sample of global firms that show a very sharp rise in interest in reshoring and friendshoring. So that's to the data. I will have more to say later if you're interested in how the landscape is changing regarding sort of the likely trends in the global economy, the GVC landscape more specifically.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ahmedou. As you listen to this,
Yes.
Are we headed to some new version of a Cold War? A US-China and US finding allies and ganging up on China? By the way, the issue of capital flows between China and the United States, China has been a net positive investor in the United States over the last 10 years to the tune of almost a factor of 2 to 1. So for the last number of years, China has not been a recipient of U.S. investments in China itself, whether that is by choice or by other forces. It has not been a major recipient of U.S. investment compared to the investment that the Chinese themselves are making in the United States. Dr. Ahmedou.
Well, for me, I would like to say that maybe we should think not only on the present, but to the future. In talking today, US, China, and others, I think I would like to give 2 figures. Maybe you know them more precisely. 10, 15 years ago, most trade was 70% transactions were made in US dollar. Then, when euro came, it was euro plus the pound and then the Japanese yen. What is the percentage today? I think the dollar is not 60%. I think if we combined US dollar, euro, the pound, and even yen in Japan, it is not over 65% maximum. So there is a new dawn in the international economy, not only Belt and Road, not only smaller countries being active, but China, the way they are dealing with things, like oil with Iran, like even I think with Saudi recently, there is a revolution in the economy going on. And as one of the speakers said before, our Chinese colleague, China look long term. And the long term, not only they see the dollar role as a mean of payment and reserve, they see it as declining or they help it to decline. Second, the Bretton Woods institutions were regulating the world are not anymore the only one. There is the BRICS Bank in Shanghai, and they are in their beginning, but they should not be neglected. If in the US, I'm mentioning US because it is the leading economy, has Exim Bank to guarantee, encourage investment, China has the same system, who is also doing it, but without publicity. So the point I would like to make is we are in a transition, maybe the middle of a transition, because Chinese do it very nicely. Not only they have been working with Iran on in payment of oil, but they are doing it with major countries also. And on international business, as I mentioned, even countries who don't have Exim Bank to guarantee their investment are doing very well. As I said, like the Dubai port is present in many parts. So in conclusion, I think we are going through an economic revolution by other means. It is not saying, and Chinese playing with time, I think they have a good point. And technology, to be more precise on your point, raw material are in most parts of the world, including the new technology. What role some African countries who have this raw material will not only, I'm not saying what role they will play, what side they will be invited to take, and how China is doing it. And China is present in Africa, North and Sub-Saharan Africa, not only through investment, not only through government, but through individual, small, family businesses. And I was surprised, for instance, in the whole Sahel, where you see small shop run by Chinese, the way French or British used to do it 40 years ago. So we are, and I will stop on here, in a true economic revolution, thanks to the technologies.
Thank you so much.
And thanks to the access, and it should not be neglected.
Thank you so much. Einar, whether we get into Cold War or not, we seem to be headed towards some kind of a divergent system, especially with regard to technology. The last Cold War was a very unequal war, asymmetric war. The US had all the technology and the products and services, and the Soviet Union had much more inferior products that competed. So it did not get into a point where people had to make a choice. They knew what they wanted. In the case of China, you have a very different situation. But there is a likelihood that given the direction that trade and politics are going, geopolitics, that there is a chance that we might get into divergent technology where you have different standards, whether it's AI, whether it's other forms of uses of technology, telephones, mobile telephones, The question really is to the extent that that is going to result into two standards and two technologies competing, the Huawei versus Apple or whatever. How does that impact the rest of the world and countries like the UAE and others who have to make a choice as to which technology to adopt and to get? And how do you think this is going to impact the geopolitics or geo-economics play a role into shaping it the other way around? It's the tail wagging the dog.
Yeah, okay. Well, let's turn our attention back to last week when the 10th year of the Belt and Road Initiative was celebrated and 152 countries came. China, over the last 10 years, invested $1 trillion. Now, I will readily admit, China has plenty of problems, all right, but they're not necessarily the ones that my colleague has pointed out. The reason that China does so well when it comes to lithium and other things is because China was interested in it earlier. They were the one who made the big leap into EVs when everyone else was saying that's years down the road. Yes, they do use state subsidies. They do get a jump on the competition. And more importantly, few people realize, is that they are willing to take lower margins. In the United States, most companies are considering 8 to 12% return as minimum. In China, we all know that there are companies that will literally do a cost plus 2%. Now, when you get back to this issue about dual standards, what does this mean? It means it's going to be more expensive for most of the world. China's their ability to produce en masse at very low cost is unsurpassed in the world. And when you start talking about demographics and things like this, well, China for the last 8 years has bought and installed more robotics than any other country. In fact, 50% of the world's total. So when you start looking at what they're doing to try to bring costs down, to try to use the digital revolution in order to manage supply chains, logistics, factory automation, all right? Yes, they are trying to stay relevant, and they will continue to do as long as it. What are other countries doing? Not just the US. The US and Europe lag in terms of their technology advancement. You understand, I mean, despite all the terrible things that they say about it, Jakarta is going to have a high-speed rail that goes 300 kilometers per hour, and the US, best we can do,
60.
Yeah, about 60, yes. 60 miles per hour, be a little bit more, 100 kilometers. So, I mean, you're seeing a very different world emerge, and a lot of it is based on the old colonial entities. The ones who suffered under colonial rule are now in a situation. And I was thinking about earlier, there was this idea about what to do about climate change. Well, I'll tell you, I mean, in 1960, the OPEC was created. 1973, it puts an embargo. Since that time, OPEC has been setting the world's oil prices through supply and demand to keep it steady. And what if other countries who controlled resources were to band together and say, we're going to create our own version of OPEC for copper, for lithium, for whatever? They would be able to price what they need for climate change, for their development, to give people an opportunity into the future. And I think this is the greatest existential threat that China represents. The idea that BRICS Plus could grow and that these entities could come together and instead of taking whatever price is given to them by their former colonial masters, they could, in essence, say, no, we will price this in, and instead of waiting for promises that are be broken, the $100 billion a year that never materializes, that was supposed to be there as of 2020, they could say, no, we're not going to wait. We're not going to wait for you to lie to us. We're not going to be disappointed. We're going to do what is necessary in order to help our own countrymen. Dr. Iadat, in the keynote, mentioned values, stability, and prosperity. That these were the core values of the UAE. Well, guess what? Values for the Chinese equals civilization. It means respect, morality. Stability equals security. Countries have a right to be secure. Prosperity, for the Chinese, they say development. There has to be a path for development of all countries. So when you start talking about divergence, yes, there is going to be. Already, Huawei has an operating system that is different. It's an offshoot of Android, but it is different. And you know how it's different? It will work on a tiny sensor that is embedded in a road, and it can work in a supercomputer, and in between on your laptop, your phone, all right, and also your station. So they're creating a different world.
Thank you so much. Actually, by way of announcement, this month Huawei introduced a new mobile phone, which for the first time, it's completely Chinese. The software, the hardware, the chips, the entire thing. And for the first time, and one of the reasons why Apple stock has been flattened down a little bit in the last month, is that the Chinese young people who love Apple are now buying this telephone over Apple, and sales of iPhone 15 has not done as well as it has. I don't know whether that's actually sustainable or not.
You can't get it.
Yeah,
people have tried. I got one, but it was taken from me.
Well, thank you all very much. We have about 10 minutes for the audience, and I'd like to call on Mr. Muhammad Saqib. I hope I'm not pronouncing your name right. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Good evening. My name is Muhammad Saqib. I'm from India. I have a comment and a small question. As Dr. Mazarei mentioned very well that India is an important player when it comes to geo-economics and all. And certainly, if the global value chain is moving from China to anywhere else, I think India is a very good candidate. But the problem is that we have become a victim of the crossfire between America and China. You know, Dr. Bollinger said that, I mean, the value chain is moving from after the Ukraine conflict, value chain is moving from China to other places. But was it really because of the morality of Russian attack on Ukraine, or was it because of the sanctions or weaponization of dollar? I mean, this is an issue. And we suffered a lot in between. The reason is that we were really starting a new economic growth paradigm. We are getting close to the USA. We are getting some kind of a technology. But suddenly, your relationship with China, the American relationship with China got bad, and then we have been suffering. I mean, I know a lot of our industry. China has a lot to offer to us at this stage where we are just developing and all. Maybe America has a high technology, very high technology. We might need it later. But we cannot absorb that technology right now. Now, China, you have put number of companies on the sanctions. Like we did not invite Huawei for our 5G because we are scared of America's reaction. So this is a very, very crucial issue for us. If America wants India to do something, to do well, being a largest democracy, then it has to give some sort of a space for us to work independently. Secondly, you mentioned, ma'am, that China is not doing well. Only yesterday, IMF has upgraded the GDP growth for China next year. That is 4.8 now. Only yesterday they did it. Thirdly, I just wanted to ask that if you are saying that America is all for liberalization, open economy and all, then why what is this contain China policy? I really do not understand it. Why would you put sanctions on people to trade in technology? Why will you ask Netherlands company to not to give machinery, chip manufacturing machinery to China?
Okay,
this is very unlike America.
Sorry, we got the question, and we'll get back.
Yeah.
I've got two more questions, and if you don't mind, we'll ask the questions, and we'll have the panel, including our colleagues on Zoom, to answer.
Ask them to be brief, please, because questions only.
Sorry?
Brief. Ask them to be brief, only questions.
Very, very short, no comments, no speeches. So the next one is Mr. Hassan Al-Hassan.
Thank you very much. I'll make a very brief remark, and then I'll ask a question, direct a question to Dr. Adnan Al-Mazarei. You mentioned the role of the Gulf states. I just want to draw your attention to a paper that we published recently at the International Institute for Strategic Studies on Gulf bailout diplomacy, which quantifies for the first time the bailout assistance, balance sheet support, currency support, and so on, that the 4 Gulf donors have provided to the Middle East since the 1960s. And we've captured around over $360 billion of soft loans, central bank deposits, and so on, which surpasses by a very significant margin what the IMF does, for example, in the region. The question is as follows. There are significant parts of the Middle East that are completely locked out of the international financial system and global debt markets, either due to sanctions or due to defaults. So Iran, Lebanon, Sudan, Syria, Palestine, of course, and countries that are on the brink of being locked out, potentially Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, and others. We've seen some efforts by the World Bank to expand concessional lending to a wider set of nations, but there does not seem to be a good alternative. How do we get out of this dilemma? Thank you.
How to offer access to financing. Next question is Mr. Walter Feichtinger. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly.
Excellent pronunciation. Thank you so much. I tried to combine 2 sessions now, because at the first sessions we heard about the importance of the overwhelming challenge of climate change. And now during the last session, we had the impression of a comprehensive challenge and comprehensive economic competition. So if I try to combine it, let me ask especially Mr. Tangen, but also the others, do you see any option, any ambition, any will of a big actor, of a big state, to take the leadership in climate change projects in order to achieve economic profit and benefit, and to be a leader and an icebreaker for other states also? Do you see the room in economic financing also? Thank you.
Very good. So on the first question as to whether the U.S. is putting direct or indirect implicit constraints on its allies to trade with China or to buy Chinese products, who wants to take it up? Do you want to take that question?
Yeah, I know Saqib.
It's a rhetorical question.
I know Saqib very well. Yeah, you're right, but I mean, this issue is just political. There's no why or where for it. It's just the way that the U.S. feels about it. A lot of it's tied into American exceptionalism. But remember, all of the things that we've talked about in terms of goods and services, China is perhaps not doing as much. No, not perhaps. They are doing less of the assembly. But the intermediate goods that are going into many of the things, well, almost all of the things that are going out from ASEAN, from other areas, even from India. India has a generic drug business. Guess where the chemicals come to make those drugs? From China. Every piece of thing that is sewn in Bangladesh, guess what? The buttons, the zippers, the cloth comes from China. So China is taking a different role in the global supply chain. In terms of the question about green finance and also the ecology, yes, China is already doing that in terms of being a leader in solar and also wind. They're also trying to do a lot more in terms of hydrogen. They are doing it, but they have changed it. When the very beginning of the Belt and Road, they did government-to-government loans. That is not sustainable because it becomes political. Once a new government comes in, they automatically criticize anything the previous government does. They have switched over through the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank that works with the World Bank and also ADB and all the rest of them in order to do project loans based on feasibility. So to the extent that there's feasibility out there, I think it's limitless in what they can do. But there's one area which Jeffrey Sachs pointed out, and I do believe, there has to be a longer-term horizon. Some of the greatest needs that countries have today for education are not a 7-year program. Right? You need 30 or 40 years to do that, but we don't have existing finance mechanisms that are able to do that. Pension funds aren't going to invest in that. So governments need to step in and start thinking about longer-term financing for these types of things in order to see real results from them.
Thank you. Dr. Adnan, do you have any comments about access to financing from some of these countries that have no real access to markets?
Sure. The gentleman, Mr. Al-Hassan, is absolutely correct that some countries do not have access to financing and they are likely to get less as interest rates globally go higher. Of course, some countries, for example, Lebanon, are in the worst shape. They've already defaulted. Other countries with debt difficulties include Egypt, Tunisia, and Jordan. There is one set of efforts being made by the multilateral development banks, especially the World Bank, to raise their lending ability by allowing those institutions to take more risk on their balance sheets and use their capital and lower their prudential standards so they can lend more. But as it was said rightly, it is going to be difficult. On the GCC support, the gentleman is also right, but I have to note that in recent times, and perhaps very rightly, the GCC countries have become more careful about lending to places like Egypt and Pakistan, requiring more reforms, and especially in the regulatory area. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I'm out of time. I want to thank the panelists for excellent conversation, discussion. I want you to join me in saying hello. Thank you all of you. And thanks so much for EPC. Very good job. Thank you.